Hello everyone, I'm Hannah, and I think we're just going to get started here. A couple things before we start. I just want to let you guys know that there's like a sign-up sheet going around, so once that goes by you, just jot your information down on that. We have information about upcoming events on the tables. There's a sheet with the next seminar, so if you want to see the future topics, that's on the table, and then there are a few other forms as well that just show a few other things that the Bluff Busters are doing, that if you are interested in attending those things. And then the last thing is, if you are interested in joining or renewing your membership, you guys can do that tonight. There are forms in the back. You just need to sign a waiver form, and then you can just bring it up to the front here. It's $25 for an individual membership, and then $40 for a family membership. So I think that's everything, unless anybody has any questions before we get started. All right, so I'm going to turn it over to Scott then.
Okay. So my name is Scott Cooper. I've been in Bluff Busters, easy to say, since it started. So I'm a lifer at this point. We were I actually teach biology at UW La Crosse, and I also teach a triathlon class, so one credit ESS 100 course that the students wanted to get started. And we were trying to think of a way to kind of take the material and present it to folks who aren't in college anymore. We wanted to make it a little bit different format, not just a big lecture hall, but actually someplace a little bit more sociable. And so we thought of doing it here. And I don't know if all of you know Bobby Schmidt sitting in the back, but his name's also on the big sign out front when you come in. This is Schmitty's here. And Bobby's been involved in the club. He's also an accomplished marathoner. He's done 7 Boston marathons, and I think he's on 5 continents now. He said he still has 2 to go. So, and he's done Ironman, triathlons, bike races, all sorts of stuff like that. So it's kind of a natural place to have it here. And we decided we weren't going to have any kind of registration fee or anything, so we're just going to ask folks to eat or drink your fee. So get a drink, an appetizer, or something like that. So we're going to just get started here. So our first one here is going to be metabolism nutrition. I apologize for the screen. I just bought it at Kmart. So I'll iron it before the next one. Okay, so when we're going to be talking here first about metabolism and nutrition. And I know that the club here is on triathlon, but really this is kind of the fundamental for any endurance sport, right? You need to understand a little bit about physiology, a little bit about metabolism, and a little bit about nutrition. And we're going to talk about this reaction up here, so don't worry if you haven't had chemistry in a couple years or decades. We'll make it really simple for you. But this is basically metabolism. This is respiration. You're taking a molecule of glucose and you're burning it in the presence of oxygen. You give out carbon dioxide and water. And we'll break this down into its component parts and understand why you eat what you do, why you have to breathe oxygen, and what your limiting factors are as an athlete with this little reaction here. And so we're going to take a little bit on muscle physiology, fuel selection, gas exchange, and then finally a little bit on hydration. And again, this is important for any sport. So here we have Josh Shively, who's doing an Ironman, but he's also an accomplished bicyclist and cross-country skier. So again, no matter what sport you're doing, you can have these things apply. All right, so we're not going to spend a lot of time on any one of these topics, but just, again, what I would think would be the main take-home message. Before I go on, I should mention, I know we have a very diverse group here. We have some folks who probably haven't done many of these things in a while. We have some folks who probably get up here and give the talk as well as I do. So I'm going to try to, with each of these, if you're like really experienced, maybe go just looking for a couple little pointers here and there. If you're new to this, and this is all like, feel like you're getting, trying to get, taking information coming out of a fire hose, I'll kind of summarize at the end of each of these a little bit like what's the main take-home message from this, right? So what's going to be on the exam? All right, no exam, don't worry. All right, so the first thing we're going to talk about with muscles, what we're trying to do when we train with respect to muscles is something called hypertrophy. Right? And so hyper means more, trophy refers to energy or growth, and so we're trying to make our muscles bigger and stronger. Right? And we do this by stressing them. Right? So you stress the muscles and then you recover, and those muscles will adapt to that stress by getting larger. Right? So they don't increase in the number of muscle cells, but the muscle cells themselves get bigger. Right? And so it's the classic here is weightlifting. Right? You can get bigger and bigger muscles. but this also going to be a pathological case. This would be cross sections of somebody's heart. This would be the left ventricle, and if you have left ventricular hypertrophy, that means the left ventricle of the heart gets really, really thick. This is somebody who has clogged arteries, and their heart's having to work really hard to push that blood through the arteries. You'll get a thicker muscle, right? So we can have this be both something we try to do and something we try to avoid, right? But we're going to talk about how we're going to try to do it, right? So we're going to work on the muscles, skeletal muscles here, not your heart. But to do this, you need to have stress, right? You need to stress the cells. But then it also requires rest. If you're constantly stressing it and never giving them a break, you're not going to get growth. Where you get the muscle growth is actually when you do the rest period, right? So if you don't take breaks now and then in your training, you're not getting the most out of that training. The other thing that you need to grow muscle is fuel, right? And the main fuels we're going to look at here would be carbohydrates and then also protein. And what they found to be kind of the magic ratio there is 4 to 1, right? So 4 grams of carbs for every gram of protein. You'll see this in all sorts of energy drinks and things like that. Turns out if you read food labels, chocolate milk and low-fat yogurt are also both just as good, right? So you can go spend a bunch of money on energy drinks, or you just keep a jug of chocolate milk in your fridge, whichever you prefer, right? But so the keys to this so far, the take-home message would be you want to stress your muscles, right? But you need to rest, and you need to make sure you're giving them enough fuel and the right kinds of fuels to see that growth, that increase in size. Okay, now if we zoom in on the muscles, this would be what's going on when a muscle contracts. This little animation over here, and you have these myosin groups, the big blue lines, and these little actin proteins here, the little red lines that slide across each other. Right? And when this happens, you can imagine it as they slide across, the muscle contracts, and then they relax again. They contract and relax. All right, and this can happen in the blink of an eye, like literally, when your eyes blink. Right, this is the muscles contract, they close your eyelid, and they have to relax again for the eyelid to come back up again. All right, so it's shown kind of slow here. These would be like the reflexes of a sloth if we were trying to have your muscles contract that slow. All right, but you get the idea, right? So these muscles have to slide back and forth across each other. That's how muscles contract and relax. Right? The reason we're going to be interested in this is where we use our energy. Right? So we need energy to make that happen, to make those muscles contract. Right? And the energy that we use in the cell to run most of these reactions is a little molecule called ATP. Right? Hannah actually put that up on the what was that? Facebook. Yeah, the Facebook page, right? So if you didn't recognize it. So ATP you can think of as a little rechargeable battery. Right? It stands for adenosine triphosphate. When it gives up a phosphate, it releases energy, and then your body quickly remakes it again back into ATP. And the take-home message here is the half-life of these ATP molecules in your cell is about a minute. Right? So these are turning over very, very quickly. You don't store any energy as ATP. It's getting used and then regenerated very fast. And a half-life means that half of the ATP gets used up in a minute, which means at 2 minutes you're down to a quarter, 3 minutes you're down to 12% of what you had to start with, and that's why you can hold your breath for about 3 minutes. Right? For about 3 minutes without oxygen, because we need oxygen to regenerate that ATP. After 3 minutes, your ATP levels are so low, your cells start dying. Right? They start running out of ATP. So that to give you an idea of how fast this is occurring, right? And that's why this molecule is really important. All right, so if we zoomed in on these little lines that are moving past each other up here, it's actually kind of like a little cruise shell. You know, where you have all the guys rowing in unison, or women rowing in unison. Right? What happens here is the myosin groups go up and attach to the actin, and then they bend. And when they bend, they move the two strands across from each other, and that gives us a little contraction we saw over here. The key with ATP is that when this happens, we're at the low energy form. In order for these two proteins to get released from each other, ATP has to come in. So this is where the energy comes in. Right? So the energy has to come in to release them, and then it goes and does its little movement thing. Right? The reason that this step's important is if you run out of energy, your muscles get stuck in this phase. Right? They get stuck with the proteins stuck to each other. Right? And what happens now is these muscles are in tetany, or if it was a dead person, we called it rigor mortis. Right? Your muscles are all locked up. Right? They're all locked up because the cells ran out of energy, and they can't break those connections between the muscle fibers anymore. Right? And if you have ATP, then they can relax. Okay, the reason this is important to an athlete, we're very rarely in the dead state, even though you might say you feel dead. When you're training, you're not really dead. All right, but it will have an impact on you if you're training, in that when muscles work, when one muscle, if I want to raise my arm, my biceps are going to be contracting, they're going to be flexing, and my triceps have to, they have to compress, right? They have to make my arm move. My triceps have to relax, right? Most of your muscles, especially for moving limbs, they work in opposing pairs, right? One contracts, the other has to relax, right? Or you have your quads and your hamstrings, right? If one contracts, the other has to relax. What can happen if you're not getting enough ATP in your muscles, and this one goes to flex and this one hasn't relaxed, you're going to have this little tearing sensation, right? That's because the one muscle's got all these guys still stuck together and the other one's contracting. You can imagine if these guys are still linked to each other and you start pulling, you get tears. All right, so this would be where you can get cramps and things like that. These are going to tend to happen if you start working out really fast, or you're really tired and try to push up that one last really big hill, and then you start feeling this kind of burning in your quads. All right, that's what's going on inside of your cells. So the key there, the take-home message, would be to make sure you're really warmed up before you do anything strenuous, and this would be why. Right? You want to make sure that those muscles are getting enough oxygen and enough glucose that they're able to make enough of this ATP to for the one muscle to relax. It seems weird, but you actually need the energy to get the relaxing to occur. Okay, so where does this ATP come from? Well, I'm glad you asked that. I threw in some pictures of Schluck clusters. This is Larry Schmidt. So if you want to end up with a body like this, you need to pay attention. This doesn't happen by accident. You need to pay attention to what you're eating. All right, so if we go back to our little equation over here, we're just going to focus on these two parts first. All right, so this is a sugar, a carbohydrate. This is where the word carbohydrate comes from. It's carbon, and H2O is water. All right, so any carbohydrate we're talking about is going to have this base structure. It's going to be, for each carbon, there may be 2 hydrogens and an oxygen. Right, so that's where the name comes from, if you're curious. Even if you're not curious, now you know. And so what we're going to do is we're going to burn this carbohydrate, and we're going to produce our ATP. Okay, so how does that happen? Oops. Okay, so this is the scariest slide I'll show you all night, I promise. Well, okay, the one before with Larry was probably scary, but this will be the second scariest slide I'll show you all night. All right, so this is inside of a cell. And the reason I want to show you this is not all carbohydrates are the same. I don't know if you guys can see our sugars up there. Can you see it? It's kind of bent. All right, so not all sugars are the same. When we talk about carbohydrates, we can talk about simple carbohydrates. So these would be things like glucose and fructose, or if we stick a glucose and fructose together, we get sucrose, which is table sugar. And we can have complex carbohydrates like glycogen and starch, where we stick a whole big long chain together. All right, so when we talk about carbohydrates, we can break them down into different types. And it turns out these behave differently in your body, and there are times when it's good to use one, and other times when it's better to use another one. Right? So we're going to use this to try to understand why you pick different carbohydrate sources at different times. So the first thing, if anything you eat or drink has to do before you can burn it, it has to get inside of the cell. Right? And it turns out that these glucose and fructose have little doors they can get into, little channels that they can use to get inside of the cell. Sucrose can't. So if you eat table sugar, it actually has to get broken down into glucose and fructose first before it can get into the cell. Right? This mixture of glucose and fructose is high fructose corn syrup. Right? What they've basically done is taken the sucrose, cleaved it already for you, and now it actually tastes sweeter than it would if we just ate the same number of calories in sucrose. Right? So when people talk about high fructose corn syrup, it's basically usually about a 50-50 mixture of these two. All right? For these guys to get into a cell, you need a protein or hormone called insulin. Right? And insulin binds to a little receptor on the surface. It's like ringing a doorbell. When it rings the doorbells, these doors open up and the sugar can get in. Right? So this is how your muscles would take up sugar, if they need to have insulin out in the blood for that to happen. Right? Any real nerds up here know what this is? All right, that's caffeine. All right, so good thing you don't know that. Only somebody really nerdy would know that. All right, so the reason I put caffeine up here is caffeine, one of the ways that caffeine works to stimulate your energy is it actually it acts kind of like insulin. It boosts this insulin response, right? So if you take caffeine and high fructose corn syrup, you're going to get glucose, you're going to get that energy into your muscle cells as fast as humanly possible. Right? Anybody ever run a marathon or an Ironman where they put Coke out on the... That's why, right? The reason they're putting Coca-Cola out there, hopefully flat, Coke out on the aid stations, is because it's basically a glucose delivery system, right? This is just going to shoot that stuff into your muscles about as fast as you can. Okay, so once it gets in, here we have our glucose, and there are about 20 reactions going from here to here. I coded them as branch 1 and branch 2, so we won't have any chemistry. All right, so once they get inside of the cell, these molecules can get converted into each other. This glucose, you can stick a whole bunch of glucoses together and make glycogen. Right? We'll talk more about glycogen a little bit later, but this is what we're trying to get our muscles to build up so that we can go and run marathons and things like that. But then once you start running that marathon, you want to take that glycogen and break it back down and burn it. In our first branch point down here, we're going to take that glucose down, and the cell is going to have to decide which direction it's going to go. And it's going to it doesn't have a brain, it's not really deciding, but it's going to pick the direction it's going to go based on how much oxygen's in that cell. All right? If you have oxygen, you're going to go down and burn that food all the way. If you don't have oxygen, we're going to make a product called lactate. Right? You guys probably heard of lactate before. There's some debate in the literature right now if lactate actually causes cramps or if it's just a marker that comes out at the same time you get cramps. But either way, one of the things we look at in athletes is something called a lactate threshold. How hard can you work before your lactate levels get high, and then you have to back off. Right? You can't go any harder than that because your cells are not getting enough oxygen. Right? So lactate is a marker that you're not getting enough oxygen. Okay. If you have enough oxygen, you move down to branch 2. In branch 2 here, your cell's deciding, do I burn it or do I store it? And once it gets to branch 2 here, once it gets to this point, this step's irreversible. So once you've gone from glucose, from a carbohydrate down to here, if you store it, it's going to be as fat. All right? And so most of our energy we're going to store as fat in our cells. We'll see that we can't store very much as glycogen. Right? So once we get down here, if you don't burn it, if you don't make ATP out of it, you're going to store it away as fat. Okay? And just for the record, since we all have drinks in front of us, alcohol feeds in right here. All right, so alcohol is not carbo-loading. Beer is not carbo-loading. It feeds in here. You either burn it or you store it as fat. Right? So beer bellies are not made of beer. They're made of fat. Oh, there's a beer belly right there. Okay, so when we look at this, this is just a slide showing how fast fructose gets into your cell. So this would be glucose from starch, glucose if it's in sucrose. This is fructose. All right, so fructose gets into your cells and gets metabolized rocket fast. All right, this is a very, very, that's why people are worried about high fructose corn syrup in our diet. Right, so if you're a couch potato and you're sitting there drinking, you know, a mega buddy of Coke, right, and like, I don't know, a pound of sugar in there or whatever it is, this is going to be going up really, really fast, right? And we'll see in a moment what this has other consequences as well. Whereas if you have that in more starch, it spreads it out a little bit, right? It delays the response. You don't get this big spike. Now, I just told you that high fructose corn syrup is actually a decent thing to use if you're an athlete, but if you're an athlete and you're out working really hard, you're not a couch potato, right? So we can't look at these things as bad and good. This would be bad if you're a couch potato. It's actually good if you're bonking in a marathon, right? You want this because you want to get it into your muscles as fast as you can. All right, so I think understanding how these things work, I wouldn't avoid Coke on a marathon. It's not going to make you fat, right, if you're bonking. Right. That's the last of your worries at that point. Right? Okay, so this kind of goofy-looking graph here is looking at this. If you understand this, you'll understand the obesity epidemic in the United States. So what happens if, I'll just focus on this part right here. Let's say at lunch, we look at two different people. One person eats a starchy meal. They're going to have a spike in their blood glucose. When their blood glucose levels go up, their insulin levels go up, right? And that insulin tells their cells to suck that glucose out of the blood, right? It says, oh, we just ate, everybody go take up some glucose. Right? And then what you get is a little bit of a crash, right? So after you eat a big meal, sometimes you feel kind of sleepy. That's your blood sugar dropping back down because the insulin just sucked it all out of the blood. If you do something that's like high fructose corn syrup, right, you're going to get a really big spike, and then you'll get a really big crash, right? And this is what happens, people who get on, if they start drinking Coke in the morning, they'll have this big pick-me-up, and then they'll crash, and then they'll say, oh, I'm sleepy, I better go have another Coke. Right? And they just go through the whole day like this, taking in just tons and tons of calories. All right? So what we really want to do is flatten this curve out a bit. Okay, so how do we do that? So it turns out that if you want to have a rock-hard body like Jamie here, or you want to lose... He's right there. Or if you want to lose weight. These are two different independent lines of research going on. But for both of them, they found that the same techniques work, the same strategies work. If you're trying to be an athlete, if you want to maximize your performance as an athlete, or you want to lose weight, the key is to spread out the meals. Right? Eat the same number of calories in the day, but you snack a lot in between. Probably the opposite of what your mom told you when you were growing up. Right? But the key here is not to eat 3 full meals like you did before and snack. Right? That would be bad. But if you take some of the calories out of your meals and eat them as snacks, it flattens out those insulin spikes, right? You're not going like this all day. Okay. And actually, if you're going to cut back on any meal, I'd cut back on dinner, right? Because dinner, you're basically going to eat it, and then you're going to go to bed, and it's going to go into that little pathway where it's like, you know, burn it or store it as fat, and it's going to say, you're not doing anything. I'm going to store it as fat. All right. My second thing with this is I'm a big proponent of food over supplements. I just like food, but I think once you understand what's in these supplements, you can get a lot of the same things just from eating normal food. All right. These things are useful at times, right? Especially like if you're in a race or something like that, you're probably not. It might be hard to pull out a peanut butter and jelly sandwich, but you can pull out a gel, right? But other times you might be just fine with the PB&J, right? And what we're looking at here are things that would get in sugar, maybe some protein. Salt. I'll put pickle juice on here too. That's one of Mike's tricks. But things that you need to take in those compounds, those chemicals, are you can probably get them just as well in food as you could in some supplements. And so we think about this as, I know food has lots of issues with it, right? There are all sorts of times when it's socially eating and holidays and all this kind of stuff. And I think most of the time you want to think of your meals as a lunchbox, right? So you're not just eating to train, but sometimes you want to make your lunchbox into a toolbox, right? So then you want to think of these as tools. It doesn't matter if you're eating, white rice for the 3rd day in a row because you're carbo loading for, a marathon or something like that. At that point, it's just a tool, right? It's just a delivery system to get carbs into your body, right? You don't really care what sauce it's on or anything like that, right? At this point, it's just a tool. So I think sometimes you want to just think of food as a tool, not all the time, because then you'd be very boring and robotic, right? But there are times when if you understand how it works, you can do the same thing with food that you could have with some of these other supplements. And Mike will talk about this in a couple months, a little bit more about, he talks about getting techie and some of the ways you can speed yourself up. But body weight is actually one of the things that you can use, again, to improve your performance. So if you're lighter, without losing muscle, so if you're have more lean muscle, you're actually going to run faster. They've done studies how much faster you can run for every 5 pounds you lose. I think you'd also climb better on a bike. And I noticed about 5 or 6 years ago, my wife told me I could lose 10 pounds, and I did. Of course, I always do what she tells me. But I found that I could actually deal with heat better. The heat didn't seem to bother me much because where we store fat is right under the skin, so it's like a layer of insulation. And I think it's harder to dispel heat that way. The trick here, I like to start off a training season pretty much at my race weight. So the time to lose weight is actually in the off season. That's the hard time. It sounds like a hard time to do it. But remember, what we're trying to do when we're stressing our muscles with that hypertrophy thing was we need to be able to then refuel them when we take rests. If you're dieting while you're exercising, you're not getting the benefit out of the exercise, right? If your goal is to increase your performance. If your goal is to lose weight, exercise is a good way to help lose weight. But if you're really focusing on performance, if you can lose the weight before you go into the season, then when you exercise, what you're eating will go into building muscle. Right? You'll actually get stronger from that. Okay, so that's our energy. How about the other part of the equation here? These deal with our gases. Actually, I should say, any questions before? Yes.
How quickly do you get to that branch too, where it has to go to energy or fat?
Well, pretty much as soon as it gets in the cell, if if you ate it and you've got enough oxygen there, it's going to go right on down. If you stored all you can as glycogen,
So basically it goes into your stomach and gets digested and then it
okay, yeah. So you would have to get absorbed from your stomach, and depending on what kind of molecule it was, it goes through the bloodstream. Then it gets taken up by other organs like your muscle or something. You don't store a lot of fat in muscle. There's some in there. That would be mostly glycogen. But if it already saturated its glycogen supply, if that's all it could fit, it would start converting it into fat. Yeah. So these things happen very fast, and then they'll reverse very fast, right? So if you need energy, it'll start burning it back off again real quick. Yeah. Any other questions? Okay. So we're going to talk about gas exchange here. So gas. Now we're talking about lungs. So this is an alveoli in the lung. And when you inhale air, that oxygen is going to diffuse. It turns out the alveoli are really, really thin, unless you're a smoker or asthmatic or somebody. There's just a single cell layer in the lungs, and then it goes right into the blood vessel. Right? And gases are basically just diffusing from here to here. There's no pumps or anything like that. It's just moving from an area of high concentration to low. And carbon dioxide is moving the opposite way. So we're inhaling oxygen, we're exhaling carbon dioxide. Right? So this is all that's happening here. And if you want, remember, this was part of our equation. So if I want to burn a lot of sugar, I need to take in a lot of oxygen, right? So I need to get this oxygen now from my lungs to my muscles, right? And there are a couple ways we can maximize that. One is, well, the way we get it to our muscles is our heart pumps blood through the lungs and then back to the heart and then all the way down through all of our muscles here. And if I want to pump more oxygen, one way I can do that is increase the heart rate, right? So I can start beating faster, right? And we'll talk about heart rate monitors in a little bit, but that's the classic we think about. You start going out and running hard and your heart starts going thump, thump, thump. All right. Some other things we can do is we can increase the amount of red blood cells we have. And you can do this by being at elevation or by doping with EPO. And we can also increase our hemoglobin levels. Now, actually, you will get some increase in these just from training naturally, right? So these will go up as you train. Okay. When we're talking about heart rate, there are kind of two extremes on the heart rate we're going to talk about. One of them is what we call a resting heart rate, and this would be best measured like right when you wake up in the morning. Just lay there in bed. If you have a watch with you, you can just sit there and just take your pulse and check your resting heart rate. This is actually a decent number to know, and we'll see why in just a second. But if you know what your resting heart rate is, and you see it starting to go up, that can be a measure that you're overtraining. This is a pretty simple way to test that, right? If you're just going too much, your heart rate just won't get back down. And again, I do this first thing in the morning. So resting isn't I'm sitting on the couch, because even sitting upright, your heart rate's going to go up a little bit. Maximum heart rate is how fast can your heart get beating, right? And there are lots of different formulas for this. A good ballpark is 220 minus your age, right, for your heart rate. And there actually, if you really want to know about it, there are different formulas for males and females and things like that. You can also measure this with a heart rate monitor if you do any of those VO2 max tests and stuff. All right, so why do we care about minimum and maximum heart rates? Well, in some ways, I think the heart rate is mostly a measure that you're going to use yourself. Right? Comparing your maximum heart rate to someone else's maximum heart rate isn't really going to tell you much. In fact, I've done triathlons with guys that had their maximum heart rate's quite a bit lower than mine. We'd be going and, mine, I'd be at 180 and they'd be at, 160 or something like that. But they were pretty close to their maximum. The key is really the difference between your minimum heart rate and your maximum heart rate. This is what you have to work with, right? So you can get from here when you're resting up to here. So these two folks both would have about the same range, even though this one I made his maximum heart rate 20 beats higher than this one, right? But if this one's got a resting heart rate of 20 beats lower, they've got about the same range going from, resting to maximum heart rate that they can play with. What you notice is that so the maximum heart rate gets a little slower each year with age. And you don't have much control over that. Training doesn't really affect your maximum heart rate all that much. It might keep it from declining, but you're not going to make it go faster. In fact, if anything, endurance training actually decreases your maximum heart rate. Your heart gets a little bigger, you pump more blood with each pump, so you don't need to pump as fast. What you can affect is your resting heart rate. That's what this table shows here, and it doesn't really matter much if we went across here for men by age, men and women, their resting heart rates aren't going to be affected that much. It's how good a shape they're in. All right, so if you're in good shape, your resting heart rate is going to go down. All right, so this black line here, I made this guy here when he's in shape, and then here he goes into the off season. Okay, probably wouldn't happen this fast, but so here, what's going to affect this same person would be that their resting heart rate is going to go up. Right? If their resting heart rate's 100, that means they get up off the couch and walk to the kitchen, and they're going to be out of breath, right? Because just that little bit of activity, they're getting up there to a pretty high level because their resting level was so high, right? So training is going to drop your resting rate. That would be what's going to be on the test. There's the okay. So how many of you guys have heard of VO2 max tests? Right? How many of you have had one done? Quite a few. Okay, good. All right. So the VO2 max test is how much oxygen, they actually measure it in milliliters of oxygen that you can move in and out of your lungs, or actually I guess into your lungs, per minute per kilogram. So it's adjusted by weight. And if we think about what the air is like, our atmosphere is 21% oxygen, it's about 80% nitrogen, actually 78% nitrogen, a lot of nitrogen, it's mostly nitrogen. But we've got a fair amount of oxygen, but very little carbon dioxide, right? So this would be like 450 parts per million oxygen, or carbon dioxide. When you inhale, you actually exhale quite a bit of oxygen still, right? The air you exhale out of your lungs still has quite a bit of oxygen. That's the way, like, the only reason mouth-to-mouth resuscitation works, right? If you're exhaling all carbon dioxide, you just be killing the person, right? So you are still exhaling some oxygen, all right? But you actually see this huge increase in the amount of carbon dioxide you exhale. All right, so you're really pumping out a lot of carbon dioxide, and this is actually what limits how long you can hold your breath, right? You mentally, all right. So we said before you can go without oxygen for a couple minutes, but what's going to make you gasp and start breathing again is the buildup of carbon dioxide in your blood. It starts making your blood acidic, and your body doesn't like that, and it says start breathing again. Okay. So VO2 max is another thing that you can affect, and this is going to be affecting again how much oxygen you can take in to your cells, which is going to regulate how much energy you can produce, right? How much glucose you can burn. And again, these are just some of the numbers here, but you can see that again you can increase this quite a bit by training. Right? So look at untrained versus a trained athlete. A lot of this is genetic. All right, so Miguel Indurain was a Tour de France cycler, probably before the EPO days, but probably in the epinephrine or adrenaline days, things like that. Bjorn Dahli's a cross-country skier. This is one of the highest values they've ever shown in a person. They're still quite a bit behind a horse or the ultimate endurance athlete, a sled dog, who can trot for weeks in Iditarod. My wife likes that part. Okay, another thing we can predict with this oxygen and CO2, I promised you I wouldn't show too many equations, but you can, what I've shown here is just a glucose or carbohydrate, and this down here would be a fat. And the only point I want to make here is when you go to burn a fat, it's less oxidized, it's already less burned than the sugar, so it has more energy in it, right? And if it has more energy in it, that means it's going to take more oxygen to burn it, right? And so if we look at glucose here, we can measure the ratio of oxygen to carbon dioxide, and they're both 6, so the ratio would be 1. If we take the ratio of oxygen to carbon dioxide. In a fat, it takes more oxygen to burn the same number of carbons, and so we actually get this respiratory quotient that's different. And the reason this is important is we can actually put a mask on somebody, have them go start running. I actually had this done once. And you can measure the amount of oxygen they're taking in and the amount of carbon dioxide they're giving off, and you can tell what fuel they're using. Right? You can tell if they're burning carbohydrate or if they're burning fat while they're running, or biking, or whatever you want to do. So just by knowing the gases you're taking in and out, you can predict what kind of fuel your cells are using. Right? And the reason that this is important is this is another thing we can control with training. Right? Another thing we can affect with training is what fuel supply we use. Right? So it turns out this is that respiratory quotient. So if you're burning pure glucose, you'd be down here around 1. If you were burning pure fat, you'd be up here at 1.5. Right? And it turns out we can't burn pure fat. We always have to burn a little glucose with the fat. So if we look at the average here, it comes out somewhere in between those two, but closer to the fat. What I'm showing down here on the x-axis is a percent of your maximum heart rate. So it doesn't matter if your maximum is 200 or 150, right? If you look at it as a percentage of that, we could set up what we call these heart rate zones. We often think of these as training zones, right? This is actually a really big part of training. When we talk about training plans in the next lecture, if any of you come back, we'll be talking a lot about what kind of training you do in the different zones. But there is actually a metabolic basis behind it, why we train at different levels in these different zones. All right, so if we were an individual that wasn't an athlete, didn't train a lot, when you're at a very low heart rate, so about half your maximum here, you're actually burning quite a bit of fat. Your body is trying to save its glucose in case a bear suddenly pops up and you have to run away from it, right? So it's going to try to burn fat when it can. But remember, burning fat takes a lot more oxygen, right? So it uses a lot of oxygen to burn that fat. So if you're not running hard, if you're just sitting around, it'll burn fat as much as it can. All right, so we call these like zone 1 and 2 are down here, like below about 70% of your maximum heart rate. As you start to work out, your body starts switching over to burning carbohydrates, right? Because they use less oxygen, and you need to generate some energy really fast. At some point, you'll actually dip below that value of 1, and this is when you start going to anaerobic metabolism. This is where your lactate threshold comes in. Okay, and so here now, you're not going to be able to sustain this for very long, right? Once you start building up a lot of lactate. One of the cool things about training is it actually shifts this curve to the right. Right? So if you start training a lot, you're going to be burning fat at a higher heart rate. Right? So this does two things. It taps into an almost unlimited fuel supply. Right? We all have, even a lean person has enough fat probably to run from here to New York City. Right? So you have a lot of calories you're tapping into there, and you're saving your sugars for later. And then also it's going to bump the lactate threshold up. So you'll be able to go up to a higher heart rate and still perform at that higher heart rate without running into lactate problems. Right? So when we talk about these zones a little bit later on, this is where part of where this comes from. Right? It's actually going to affect the fuel supply that you're using. And again, you can actually measure this. So because of this, most of the training that we'll talk about wanting to do is either in zone 1 or 2. So that's the really low, not really low, but lower heart rate. Sometimes they call this the fat burning zone. If you're ever on any of those cycle things in the Y or ellipticals or whatever, they'll have, fat burning zone. That's what they're trying to get you to do. They're trying to get you to work out at about 50 to 70% of your maximum heart rate, because there you are going to be burning proportionally more fat than carbohydrate. So this is kind of low heart rate, fat burning. You will see a shift in your respiratory quotient, but it's going to take about 18 months. Right? So this would be something where you're not going to say, okay, in April I'm going to drop my respiratory quotient down. Right? It takes a long time for this to build up, but if you keep at it, and again, this is the low heart rate stuff, so this isn't going out there killing yourself, you'll eventually see the benefits from that. And most of the recommendations are for about 80% of your training to be in these zones. Zone 4 is your speed work. So this is where you're getting up right below your lactate threshold, and this is going to help you shift that lactate threshold over. One of the things they learned from this actually came more from diet studies, is that if you do this type of exercise, if you throw in, a lot of times people just go out and figure, okay, well, I'll do the fat burning stuff, I'm going to burn fat over there. You won't burn fat while you're in zone 4, but for about 6 to 8 hours after you work out, you'll be burning more fat. Right? And your body's basically saying, okay, that bear might be coming back again, I'm going to save my glucose and start burning more fat. Right? It's trying to replenish its carbohydrates supply, so it switches over to more fat burning. So you'll actually get benefits from fat burning in both zones. This one will be while you're working out, this one will actually be after you're working out. Okay, any questions on gases? You think someone's going to talk to you that long about gases? Okay, all right, the last part of our equation here was when we do this, we actually produce water as a byproduct, and we're also going to generate heat. And so here we have our dog staying cool. Heat is something that we have to deal with in the Midwest a lot, both in racing and in training. And so just a couple things while we're here. The concern you have with training in the heat, and it'll be on one of the later slide, or next slide I think, is heat exhaustion and heat stroke. Right, so there are actually medical conditions you can get into with this. You can acclimate to the heat, but it takes a while. Right, so it takes about a week or so of actually going out and training in the heat to get used to it, to get acclimated to it. But what's going on physiologically when you're out in the heat is something that medically they would call hypovolemic shock. Right? So hypo is low, volemic is volume. So you basically get a low blood volume, right? And that eventually, if you imagine like slitting your wrist and bleeding all over the place, right? Eventually, your blood volume would drop, right, and you would go into shock. Right here, your blood volume drops, but it's not leaving your body, right? It's still in your body. All right. So where's it going? Where a lot of it's going is actually to your skin. So as you get hot, your capillaries near the skin dilate, they get bigger, and that pumps more blood out by the skin, and that allows you to get rid of heat. Right? So it's doing that on purpose. That's why you're sweating and your skin gets really hot. When it does that, there's less blood available in the core circulation to go to all your other vital organs and your muscles. Right? So it actually decreases the net volume when all your blood vessels start expanding. Less blood is able to get through your lungs and to all your tissues. The other reason you can lose, right, that would be probably the one that you may not think about as much. The one that you probably do think about is just the sweating itself. Right? So as you start sweating, you can actually measure your sweating rates if you want. I think Mike has a way to do that. But they can be around a liter an hour. Right? That's quite a bit. Right? A simple way is just to go out and run for an hour or something like that. Weigh yourself before you go. Don't drink anything or pee or anything like that. And then come back and weigh yourself again, and you can figure out about how much you sweat in that hour. The problem is you can't reabsorb as much as you're losing. All right? So your intestines, especially running, are not going to absorb as much liquid as you're losing. All right? So you're going to become dehydrated from sweating. You're going to have a lower blood volume because of the vasodilation. And so in the end, you can wind up with some kind of nasty medical consequences. Heat exhaustion is the weaker or the milder version of this. You might start feeling dizzy or nauseous, maybe some cramping. Here you're sweating a lot and your skin feels very hot. When you have heat stroke, the key thing, and you pretty much have to diagnose this yourself, other people probably aren't going to notice it in you, is if you stop sweating. Right? So if you're out running on a really hot day and all of a sudden you stop sweating, stop running. Right? Go get somewhere cool, because this actually is potentially lethal condition. Right? You could be very close to going into shock. All right? If you keep going, basically your body is just shutting down. Right? It's not even trying to maintain your body temp anymore. If you stop sweating, your body temp's going to go up really, really fast. Okay. So the tricks here would be making sure you stay well hydrated, make sure you keep enough salts in you, and again, this is one where you just have to kind of pay attention, right? There's no point going out there and being like totally macho and say, oh yeah, I can get through it. One of the downsides, even if you have heat exhaustion, you're going to be very, very sensitive then to developing heat exhaustion again for a couple of weeks. All right, so once you've had it once, it's kind of like frostbite. Once you get it once, that area can be really sensitive. So if you do push it too hard and don't back off when you start noticing some of these warning signs, it could impact you for a while. All right, so more on food. The holy trinity of Cajun cooking, you all know, is peppers, onions, and celery. All right. Our holy trinity of endurance nutrition is sugar, salt, and water. All right, so these are the three things if you're going to be racing on. If you just wanted to focus on three things, this is really what you're going to be focusing on. Right, so now we're not talking about dinner and breakfast and lunch. This is just in a race. And one of the ones I just want to mention briefly here is salt. So one of the things that we have to worry about, read my cool screen here, is something called hyponatremia. You guys heard of that one before? Yeah. Okay. So hypo again is low. Natrium is sodium. So that's why sodium is abbreviated Na. It's for the Latin for salt, is natrium. So these are people who have you end up with low salt in your blood. Right? And the reason for that is this would be people who are out doing a marathon and they're just drinking water. Right? So they're sweating, they're losing salt from the sweat, but they're just replacing it with water. Eventually their blood levels of sodium get low, and that can have some serious medical problems. All right, so when we talk about race day nutrition, again, here we're going to be focusing primarily on sugar, salt, and water. It used to be, I remember way back when I was in high school, like before a race, you went out and you had a big spaghetti dinner the night before, then you laid there in bed couldn't fall asleep because your belly was up to here, doing your marathon. Well, they've changed that. Actually, really, your complex carb loading should be 2 to 3 days before your event, right? And preferably, I prefer to do it at breakfast or lunch, so you make sure you get a good night's sleep. So don't eat a huge dinner and then try to go to bed. Eat a huge lunch, and it'll be mostly through and digested. Talking to both Maggie and Josh, they have their secret weapons of wine and hops loading, but as we all know, those are fat now, so I would say that more for after the race. So the 2 to 3 days before the race would be more the complex carbs, starches, things like that. The day before, this is where I'm thinking about packing every little nook and cranny in your body up with salt and sugar and water, right? So basically as much as it'll take. So you could eat some normal meals, but this is where I like to actually salt load. So a glass of V8 juice has got about 1.2 grams of salt, half potassium, half sodium. So that's actually a really good balance, a really easy thing to have in the fridge. This is also good if you have like a really hot week. Just have a glass every day. That's your salt protection for the day. Or if you don't like V8 juice, like Mike, you can drink pickle juice. And this is also the time to be doing more of the simple sugars, so things that are really easy to digest, right? So things like Gatorade, white rice, stuff like that. And be very, very well hydrated. So you're just basically loading your body up with everything you can take. There's Mike. Okay, so during the race, it's going to vary depending on the distance you're going to do. And we'll see why in the next slide here. But basically for any race, I would eat some breakfast about 2 hours before the race. I usually do some energy drink, maybe a Cliff Bar or something, and a banana, so something really light, right? No big stacks of pancakes and vats of oatmeal or anything like that. All right, for a sprint or Olympic race, I keep it pretty simple, and you'll see why. If we're keeping our race under 2.5 hours, you're really racing on what you ate the day before, or the couple days before. So maybe some energy drink and a gel, that'd be about it. If you get into the half Ironman and Ironman distances, then you actually have to start taking in more calories, because you're going to be burning more than you have stored. All right? And these are some of the stuff that Maggie told me for Ironman, and this is what I found and worked really well for me. About 1 to 2 bottles of fluids on the bike, 200 to 300 calories an hour, and that works out to 2 to 3 gels. So the last Ironman I did was I had 25 gel packets, which is disgusting, and a gram of salt an hour. All right, this is, I mean, these are kind of toxic levels we're talking about here, but that's why you don't do these very often, right? Because this is not normal eating, right? This is now we're into toolbox mode here. This is what do I need to get myself across the finish line, all right? The other trick here would be don't skip the early aid stations, right? There's a tendency, you know, even in a shorter race to think, oh, you know, I'll just blow by the first couple and I'll eat the later ones. Well, it takes a while for everything to get into your system. If I was going to skip any, I'd skip the last couple, right? Because by then you eat those and they're going to be in there while you're going to get into your bloodstream about the time you're putting your bike on your car, right? So don't skip the early ones. All right, so why do I think that it makes a big difference what you're eating on a half Ironman and Ironman, and it doesn't matter as much what you eat in a sprint race? Well, have you guys heard of the death zone before for climbers? You get above 20,000 feet, and your body can't take in as much oxygen as it's using, right? And so you're basically very slowly starting to die. So when these guys go up into Everest, they basically get to the top as fast as they can and come back down before they die. That's the goal. All right. Well, I came up with a metabolic death zone for triathletes, right? So the metabolic death zone, for most of us, is about 2 to 3 hours. You can store 2 to 3 hours worth of carbohydrates, glycogen, in your muscles. So you can store about 400 grams in your muscle, about 100 grams in your liver, and most of that's going to go to provide glucose for your brain, right? So that's kind of off limits for anything we need in a triathlon. You don't need to think, right? But for your muscles, you can only store so many calories in there, right? So the trick is then for a sprint or Olympic, if you're done in under 2-3 hours, you're fine, right? You're pretty much going on your stores. You start going into the 5, 10, 12, 17 hour time frame, you're spending a significant amount of time, right? 2 to 15 hours, where you're already past what you have stored in your body, right? So there, you're racing on what you're eating, literally, on the bike or on the run. I haven't figured out how to eat on the swim yet, but I'm working on it. All right. So the other thing here, and the reason I call this the death zone, is you can't take in as much as you're burning. All right, so these are somewhat hypothetical numbers, but let's say on the bike you're burning 200 grams an hour of carbohydrate. You can probably consume about 90. All right, running's even worse. You're going to use more, and your gut just shuts down when you start running. You're going to take up even less. Same thing with water. You're not going to be able to take in as much as you're sweating off. All right, so you're into a point here where you're going to be running your body into a deficit. Right, you're going to be, it's going to start to hurt. Right, even if you're well trained and everything. And this is where these races, to me, really become about nutrition. I mean, there's obviously a lot of training and everything, but you have to really have your nutrition worked out when you go into one of those races. Oh, I guess that's it. So these are our adorable little iron mice. One of them's here. There's Jen.
Hi
There's
there.
Jen. Marcus. Okay, any questions? Looks like we got done a couple minutes early, so that's good. Yeah.
Other than the gels, if there are foods that you're taking in on a half Ironman or an Ironman, what are you recommending eating?
You know, I've tried eating and it just doesn't work for me. So I just do gels. Basically, the thing with the gels is it's already all digested for you. If you think of it that way, it's kind of gross. But you're eating like little. I don't know if you know what we're talking about. These gel glue packets you pop off, and it's like eating frosting. Right? You just slap it into your mouth and swallow it down. But I mean, really, it's going to go right into your bloodstream and go right into your muscles. Your stomach doesn't really have to do anything to it. And part of the problem people run into, especially in these longer events, is your gut just shuts down. There's a kind of a nervous system explanation for it, the fight or flight thing. So if you feel like you're getting chased, everything with a sphincter in your body shuts off. So basically, so that you can just run, right? And that's what's happening. So your gut and everything else pretty much shuts down. So.
Thank you.
Yeah.
You had explained that only a certain amount of that gets absorbed back into the system to gain.
That's about the maximum your body can absorb.
Are certain foods better for gain, or does it not really matter that much?
You know, again, if you break it down, so I guess there'd be two things. One would be if you just ate pure sugar, right, gets in there and it really doesn't have to do anything. Your intestines will just absorb it into the bloodstream and go. And even then, if you don't have enough water in there, it'll be hard for it to absorb it. If it has to digest it at all, if you were trying to run on eating a piece of pizza, you know, and your body has to take that and break that pizza down into the components that have to get absorbed, that's going to make it even harder, right? So basically, you're making it as easy as possible for your body to get those calories into your bloodstream and into your muscles. So that's why I would stick with. Again, to me, if you're talking racing, it's salt, sugar, and water. Really, I mean, you don't need anything. You're a hummingbird for however many hours you're out there. You're living off your little red bird feeder with stuff. That's really all you need. Yeah, I wouldn't get panned. I mean, training's totally different. You can do a lot on training because you're not going as hard. Yeah.
How do you find your ideal race weight?
I just know from experience. I just know that if I get much lighter, then I start feeling like I don't have the power I normally had, and if I get any heavier, well, I probably don't need to be heavier. So it's just kind of trial and error. Yeah, and again, weight's a tough thing. I know there are lots of factors involved in it and all that. The take-home message I'd have from that would be, if you're really serious about racing that year, don't try to lose weight while you're racing. I mean, to me, ideally, I've only done 2 Ironmen, but both times I weighed the same at the beginning of the training season as at the end, and that was ideal for me. I didn't gain or lose weight while I was training. So I was probably turning some fat into muscle, but I wasn't like dropping 10 pounds, because then I'm not building muscle, right? Everything's going into training. So there's another.
Isn't there a lot of talk about different sugars to use while you're racing and some create byproducts? Or is that
Oh,
ours?
I don't know about that. I mean, so if it's just a straight up carbohydrate, I mean, they're pretty simple, and your body converts them all one into the other. Pretty much the gold standard in metabolism is glucose. So, oops, make you look at this again. But pretty much everything goes through glucose and then it gets metabolized. So if you eat other sugars, they'll first get somehow transformed into glucose and then burned. So that they really just should have carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. They shouldn't be anything. But if you find something, I'm always interested in those things.
Someone claim a certain amount of simple and a certain amount of complex.
Sure. Yeah. Yeah. So what they're getting at there is, yeah, you've got some. So that's going to affect the composition's going to be the same. If you like burned it down and counted up the number of carbons, hydrogens, oxygens, they'd be the same. Like glucose and glycogen would be the same. It's how they're stuck together. So just take this is glycogen, like in your muscles or starch, they're the same. It would just be a whole bunch of glucoses stuck together, and then your body sits there and clips off the glucoses one at a time when it needs them. So, yeah. So compositionally, these guys are the same, but this one just happens to have hundreds.
Is some of them easier to digest than others, like versus refined sugar?
Sure. Yep.
You know,
Yep. So actually, yeah.
you run into digestive problems, you know, in the long run.
Yep. Exactly. Yeah. So if you ate, so glycogen and starch are the same. Glycogen's in animals, starch is in plants. But if you had outside of your cell here, if we put our glycogen up there, so if you ate starch and then sucrose or then high fructose corn syrup, your body would take the longest to break down the glycogen, and then it would be the sucrose, and then it would be the high fructose corn syrup. So if you wanted to eat a mixture that had all three of them in there, you'd be getting some early, mid, and late. You know, some stuff is a little slower to digest. Again, what I would do if you're going to try this for a race or something, I would try it first racing and make sure it works for you, or on a really hard workout or something. Because sometimes those things get in there and your body doesn't break them down, and then they just sit there, right? And that's not fun.
Is that what stomach cramps are? Is it?
Not necessarily. It could cause some stomach cramps. A lot of times that I think it's more salt levels. A lot of times you'll get cramps if your salt levels start to get low. But I think what you get more would be like bloating. You get real gassy. Yeah, because you basically got the stuff sitting in there that you can't get rid of.
And burping.
Burping, yeah, yeah. Burping, farting, all that stuff. Yeah.
That was one of my questions. When you're going through the training, what are some of the simple symptoms that you're looking at? If you're low on sugar, low on salt, low on water, how can you recognize that?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so so I guess it depends on what you're working on. So if you're in a race, are you talking about like training? Training.
Yeah.
So in training, I guess I err on the side of making sure I got enough of everything, because your body will deal with it. I mean, even salt, you can eat quite a bit of salt, and if your kidneys are working, you'll pee out what you don't need. So I just throw everything in there. I figure my body's going to take what it needs and get rid of the rest. There's not much point in drinking more water than you can absorb, and you'll know sometimes you'll just be in there sloshing around. You can feel the water sloshing when you're running. You're drinking more than you can absorb, and you can skip an aid station or not drink a water bottle or whatever. So I don't think you can really, for the most part, overdo it. I think those guidelines that Maggie gave me are pretty good. And again, that's for a race, so that's probably even, that's more than you would do training. Where do I have her numbers here? But I think a lot of it too is just, you got to figure out kind of what works for you, kind of just playing around with stuff. Yeah, so these are pretty good. I mean, most people probably don't drink more than a water bottle or two in an hour. That's quite a bit. I mean, if you're on a bike ride, you'd be sitting there like this the whole time. And even in a race, that's a fair amount. I mean, it's hard to physically take in that much while you're going hard. Yeah. I would say just kind of do trial and error a little bit. But I would start out, like I said, if it's hot in the summertime, I'm drinking water all the time. I do a glass of V8 every night. Just that's my salt insurance for the next day. If I know I'm going out doing a bike ride or something like that. The sugars usually for me, if I'm doing a workout under 2 hours, I don't do energy drinks. I just do water. If I'm going over 2 hours, then I do energy drinks for the whole reason.
So if you
I'm trying to get that to catch on.
If you're doing a longer race, how do you balance your energy drink versus gel?
I do both. Yep. So what I was doing this last one was I was doing about a gel every 20 minutes, which is again gross. And then I'd hit the aid stations. I'd do the energy drink at one, and then like the next one I'd do water. And you're just doing little sips. They just hand you those little glasses, so it's not like you're drinking a water bottle at each stop.
Like on an Ironman distance, I mean, some people are saying you need to take on some protein during the time, and
I've heard that, and
Hammer has, I mean, they have the stuff that has a lot of them
right
protein in it.
Yeah, they'll sell you everything, right?
For long
Yeah.
distance.
So I actually tried that back for half Ironman, probably 5 or 6 years ago. That's when the protein drinks really started coming out. And again, I would try going hard on it before you do a race on it, because that's what I found. That's just eat my stomach up. I couldn't do it. And really, if you're going that hard for that long, your body's not building muscle, right? It's basically sucking calories out of every place it can go. It's going to build muscle when you go to rest.
Yeah.
Right, so I think that protein's really important afterwards, after a hard workout or after a race, get some protein in you. I don't think it's doing a whole lot while you're going hard. Again, I know there's some evidence out there kind of both ways on it, but if you can go hard on that stuff, then that's great. I know I can't. I've tried that stuff and it just, I'm burping it up the whole run. I don't like it.
Is there a gel that's easier on your stomach?
You know, I take whatever they give me. Some people have preferences, but you know, a lot of times at a race, they're whoever, you know, Hammer's sponsoring them or Goo or somebody, you're going to get what they're handing you. So
Unless you bring your own.
unless you carry your own, but that's a lot. I mean, I carried a bento box on the bike, but then on the run, you're not going to carry a dozen gels bouncing around.
You get enough sodium in the gels and that energy drink?
No, I was doing salt tabs. Yeah.
How often do you use salt then?
Well, I kind of did the math, and I think I was doing like, I was actually doing them about every time I did a gel, so I do about 3 tabs an hour. It's a lot. No, I mean, a gram of salt's a lot of salt. And
I really
that's
thought
per hour.
those power gels had enough sodium in them.
No, they're like 100 mgs of salt or something like that. It's probably full. Anyone got one on them? This crowd would like. Yeah.
I found that when I'm training on sometimes when it's hot, 2 or 3 hours later, I'll start getting a headache. Do you think that's from dehydration, or do you think that's from the salt?
I wouldn't know. I would say either, and I would just. So these are pretty hot runs you're doing. Yeah.
That's when I notice it the most.
Yeah. What I would suggest would be make sure you get enough salt in the day before, because that really makes sure it gets into all your muscles and everything. If you drank a V8 and then went and ran, it's probably mostly going to be sitting in your gut the whole time. So I think the day before is actually a good time. I think a lot of training you do is you're racing on what you put in your body the day before. So I would do that. Make sure you're well hydrated, and then right when you get done, that would be another time to just drink some salt. You know, and again, that's to me. I don't really love V8 juice. It's just a way to drink salt. So yeah.
Well, I'm just offering an idea for people that are doing halves and full Ironmans, if they can, using the contact on the website and find out what the aid stations are going to have, then they could train with whatever the aid stations, see if it works for them before they get in the race and find out, oh, geez, I don't like Gatorade, that flavor.
Yeah.
Then they're screwed.
Yeah. I hate it when they hand you a banana gel. Yeah.
That I've heard, I don't know how true it is, but what I was told is if you're going along at a certain intensity, I suppose, if your heart rate starts climbing up, you might need water. If it starts going down, you might be dehydrated. So I've been trying to use that, and it seems to work.
Really? Okay. Huh. Well, I didn't know about that. Your heart rate goes up, you need water?
Dehydration.
Yeah, I guess that's true. Your blood volume gets smaller, so your heart rate will go up. That would make sense.
For whatever reason,
Yeah.
if it goes down,
Yeah, my thing, so actually the first thing I did, I bonked like mile 18 in the run, and I just did everything. I figured it was sugar, salt, or water, so I just did them all. So, I mean, you can try to, it doesn't hurt to try to tease it apart, but, when in doubt, just throw the kitchen sink at it, and somebody will fix it.
You can all
I don't know if it's right or not, but I've kind of come to realize that any race over, if it's a 2-hour race or something like that, I'll do sports drinks. Anything over like a marathon, 4 hours or so, I stay away from sports drinks,
Yeah.
I seem like I have a problem. I think my thought might be the refined sugars.
It could be the sugars. They do have, I think they tend to be a little bit more acidic too. They might have a little acid in them. But yeah, again, some people can run on one thing and others can't. So really that I would test it yourself and find out what works. Was it?
Yeah, I eat a couple eggs before running a marathon, like two
Oh,
and a half hours beforehand. Is that doing any? Is it going to be?
Boy, you'd be probably just getting into your system. It takes, it would take about that long to break it down, about 2 hours.
I do it mainly so I'm not hungry at all, and I generally don't feel hungry.
Yeah, I mean, really, you don't need to eat. I would have something in your stomach, even for a sprint, just because your stomach it's actually sends hormonal signals back to your brain saying feed me, which you don't want to have it doing while you're running. So having something in there to kind of keep it quiet is good. But I don't think it's really doing a whole lot other than the simple sugars and water you'd be absorbing within 2 hours. But pretty much anything you have to digest is going to take longer.
Where do you think potassium fits in, like when you have bananas along the route and stuff?
Yeah, no, potassium's good. So bananas are, I love bananas, but they don't really have as much potassium as people think. If you really want to, so if you buy the salt tabs now, they're going to have, a good salt tab will have a balance of potassium and sodium, and then even things like calcium and magnesium that are good. So they're not just sodium chloride. They're going to have a whole mix of different ions that you need. The other thing would be, again, and this is where it's good just to read labels, things like V8 or something like that. They're about 50-50 sodium and potassium. And I can't remember, there's some salt substitute or something you can buy that's actually potassium chloride instead of sodium.
It's like the Morton's light salt.
Yeah, so you could actually get that and you could mix them. And then when you're cooking, you'd be doing half sodium, half potassium.
Do you prefer certain salt tabs over others, or what?
I just grabbed whatever Emily had.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, I figured it.
But I didn't realize there were different kinds.
Yeah, I would read them. I mean, most of the good ones now that are set for athletes do have a mix of the different salts. Again, I'm not enough of a connoisseur of salts to know which ones work better than the others.
They have a salt stick.
I really just throw it in there. When you get down to the basic biochemistry, once you boil things down to, is it glucose or salt or whatever, they all work about the same. It's more going to be what your system will handle.
What do you say about caffeine and hydration? I mean, kind of the balance between that?
Yeah, caffeine really doesn't dehydrate you as much as people say. And if you're really are drinking, the way it dehydrates you is it makes you pee more. So, if you're really out there working hard, you're not losing a lot of water by peeing, right? Most likely. So you're that would be it's for an athlete. It's probably not a big deal in terms of hydrating that way. And I think even to get dehydrated on it, you got to drink like a pot of coffee or something crazy like that. Quite a bit of caffeine. Those gels, though, I mean, I didn't sleep for like 2 days. Like all the ones with caffeine in them. Oh my god. Yeah, it's bad for you. Don't do those. Okay. I know some folks probably go. Yeah.
Does that make a difference? I'm a real sweater. Does that make a difference in the way you would feed your body?
Sure. Yeah, I think you would definitely benefit from salt loading the day before. Make sure you get enough salt in your body. Your body will store up quite a bit. And then as you're sweating, it'll pull it out. Also, having extra salt and extra carbs in your body actually carry more water with them. So it'll actually help you stay hydrated more. You need water to keep the salt and the carbohydrate in solution in your body. So you'll actually retain more water that way. So that would be good. No, I think those are things you can kind of measure. You can measure. I know it's easy to measure how much volume you're losing, and Mike had a way to actually measure the salt content of it. Didn't you have some patch or something you could do to?
I didn't, but you can do.
Or you can.
You can do tests where you measure the amount of sodium you lost.
Yeah, but the simple way is just to weigh yourself, go out and run or something, and then weigh yourself again, and see how much you lost, and you'll have a pretty good idea. Most people are going to be around a liter an hour. That's a good ballpark.
So once you take that salt tablet, how long is it going to take before it's doing you any good?
That's a good question. I don't know that. Salt should go in pretty fast. I would think within an hour, 45 minutes to an hour. Because you don't have to digest it. You just go right through your guts. It should be absorbed. Again, I wouldn't use them on a sprint or Olympic, but if you're going to do a half or an Ironman, you start eating them on the bike, and they're going to be in your system by the time you start running, which is where you're really going to notice it. Yeah.
terrible. When I'm taking a gel.
What happens?
Take a gel, and I swear within 2 minutes I feel better. Is that just in my head then?
Yeah, that would have to be, because I mean, it's really about, for most of those things, it's going to be about 45 minutes or so.
So there is some studies out about that your body, when you taste it in your mouth, that you're actually starting to absorb it, and your body is starting to act like it's already absorbed in your system, even though it hasn't yet.
Yeah.
So they've done studies where they've just had people swish around some sugar in their mouth and do a time trial, and they've actually done the exact same performance as actually drinking it.
Yeah. So this would even be with just pure fructose here. Here's like 50 minutes, and you're just starting to see the effects of it, like showing up. So, yeah, I mean, it has to get all the way down into your small intestines, which is where it's going to get absorbed. And then it has to get into the blood, then it has to get into the muscles. So there's a little bit of a time lag there, just kind of transit time type thing. But that's why it's usually good to, start and not stop, right? So that you're really racing on what you ate, an hour ago or something like that.
So all gels are fructose?
Oh no, I don't even know what's in gels. I mean, it's probably, I bet a lot of them are sucrose, and maybe a mix. Yeah, there are so many different kinds out there. Yeah. But they're mostly going to be carbohydrate based. And some might have protein in them, they'll have some salt. Yeah. It's expensive frosting. All right. Well, we have our next session. Pull up the date here. If anybody's still, if I haven't scared you all away, we'll take a look at training plans. Now, this one will actually have some blank sheets, so I'm hoping we'll get this one done a little early. We'll sit by table, so if you want to work on a training plan for a different race, you can think of a race you want to do. We'll show you how to work backwards and set up a training plan for it. Or you can just sit here. So, yeah. All right. Good.